It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 28. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we take a look at the headlines in the world of creationism from this past week. This week we have Answers in Genesis, looking for interns, ICR, beating the continuous environmental tracking drum, Jensen Twitter account, and Ichthyosaur fossils. Well, that and a whole bunch more coming up. Did I really say this week in creationism? I should have said this month in creationism. I just looked and it's been a little bit over 3 weeks since I've been able to record an episode. And so that means there's a lot of things that have happened in creationism over the past 3 weeks. So we better get to it. Got a whole smattering of different stuff from different sources that we want to discuss today. The first thing I'm going to start with is an article on the Answers in Genesis website, Protein Coding Genes. Do they challenge evolutionary assumptions? And I'm not interested in getting into this article in terms of its content. I discussed that a little bit elsewhere, and I also discussed the author of this particular paper, Chang Laura Tan, in a special episode of a special video I put on my channel here, in which I discuss her qualifications and some of her interesting relationships with other what I call predatory journals. So look that up if you want to find out more about this author. As you know, I always look to see who the author is of different articles and Answers in Genesis and try to learn something about them, about their qualifications, and maybe some of their particular biases, before I read an article. But what I was intrigued about this article is that this Chang Tan obviously has some skills in bioinformatics. She has done a lot of genome comparisons, a lot of statistical analyses. You can see that she has a BS in chemistry and a master's in chemistry, and she has a biochemistry PhD, and she's also done some postdoctoral training in genetics at Harvard Medical School. And that really caught my interest because I've been thinking a lot about Nathaniel Jensen. We've been talking about Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's book Traced, which is an attempt to reinterpret the Y chromosome genealogies within the confines of biblical chronology. And one of the things that I've already talked about on a previous video is, and I will probably talk about in the future a little bit more as well and expound upon it a little bit more, is his need for reviewers, his need to have others in the young earth creationist community look at his materials and give him feedback. I mean, this is the way that science should work if the intent is to put out the best work that you can. You need to have fellow experts examine your work and make sure that you're not running astray. And the thing about Nathaniel Jensen is he doesn't actually have experience in the area that he is attempting to publish. And so it becomes even more important to have experts in the field review his book. And what I noted was I went down to the bottom of this particular article, which was published in Answers Research Journal, and I see that Chang Tan thanks Andrew Jones for his help with calculating numbers of homologs. Rod Standler, who is I think he says medical equipment, and he's in the medical industry, but not necessarily a scientist per se. Paul Nelson, who's well known in the ID community, for comments on the manuscript, and she also acknowledges a couple other individuals with help with computers. This is an interesting acknowledgement section because usually in a peer-reviewed journal, individuals usually thank the reviewers for giving comments and making the paper better. And so maybe Rod Stadler and Paul Nelson were reviewers of the submitted manuscript, but the way this reads to me is that they made comments on the manuscript prior to her submitting it. So she's not really thanking the reviewers of this, from the Answers Research Journal. But so all of that's to say, I I find the whole peer review process, I'm a little skeptical of the peer review process at these creationist journals. None of these individuals, as far as I can tell, would have the ability to judge her work. And as I read through the article, and again, I don't want to get into the details of the scientific details of her particular article, but I know enough to know instantly as I read through that article where there's some really big problems. Like if I were a reviewer on that article, I would have pointed to a number of things, and I would have pointed to literature that would suggest that she needed to think along different lines, right? And she needed to at least accommodate other people's information, right? Other publications. But I'm still trying to get around to my main point here. My main point is not actually about Chang Laura Tan's paper. It's that I suddenly realized that she at least looks like she's someone who could potentially assess Nathaniel Jensen's book. And yet he doesn't acknowledge her in his book. He mentions there were possibly other reviewers that we're not being told about, but there wouldn't be any reason not to say that she was a reviewer, because she's been very public using her name, even though she's at a public university. And so why not have her review his book and give feedback, right? I've said that I haven't seen that he's really had real geneticists look at his book. So here we have a person with genetics background publishing on papers that are genetics oriented in their research journal at Answers in Genesis. And yet Nathaniel Jensen doesn't seem to be taking advantage of that, or not being, that resource isn't being utilized. It's when you have so few individuals who can assess each other's work, it seems like it'd be incumbent upon you to find every possible individual to do so if you want to be sure that you're not stumbling and making basic errors, because we all make errors when we work on our own personal projects, and we lose sight sometimes of criticism, and so it's hard for us to really be critical of ourselves. We need those individuals outside to take a second look at what we've written. But let's move on. Let's stick with Answers in Genesis. Answers in Genesis is looking for interns. Essentially, they're looking for help at the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter for the summer, when, of course, they expect large crowds to come in. And they operate a lot and have in the past on volunteers who help out. And they have had an internship in the past, but they're really going to expand this internship in this program called Embark. A student intern program with eternal impact, as Ken Ham says. And Ken Ham's been talking a lot. Remember, we've looked in previous episodes. He's been thinking a lot about his legacy, about the legacy of Answers in Genesis, and how he can continue that when he's no longer actively involved. And so, like he starts out here. Last month, I explained our burden to be able to bring young people, students, in for seasonal jobs. And he complained at the time about how difficult that is to do. There aren't many places for them to live and stay in the area. They have to have a reason to be able to leave home and be able to come there. And so we need to equip these folks for the future. And so one thing you learn in this article is that they're going to start building student housing, housing for interns right there on the site, right? So they never have to leave, right? You can come to the Ark Encounter. You can live there, right? Have your Bible studies in the morning, and then go to work, and then come back, and then do everything in this very protected, secluded environment. And I think also this is part of a way to attract volunteers. It's sort of, hey, you have homeschoolers out there who don't want their kids to go off and work in, I guess you could call, secular jobs, right? And can send them to Ark Encounter, where they can be in a more secure environment and sort of being protected at this time in their development, right? So the other intriguing thing down here is, a number of years ago, as our attractions were being developed, I and a number of our staff sought ways to understand how to conduct staff guest services training. For instance, of course, they went to the leaders of Chick-fil-A and they attended courses offered by the Disney Institute. All right. I remember sitting through Disney course, learning how they treat guests and thinking how what it would be like to have Christian courses in these same areas. I guess I could insert the joke here about maybe Ken Ham has been groomed to do what he's saying he would like to do now, right? By the Disney courses. All right, learning from Disney how to treat their guests and grow their business. Sticking with Answers in Genesis, another article by Ken Ham. And again, I said he's been writing a lot about sort of the nature of the ministry, the future of the ministry, how to protect the ministry. This culture that he feels like is enclosing around him from every different side, and we're going to see that in this particular article. So, coping with creationism. How should Christians respond? And that's a perfectly appropriate question, because I think if you're not a young Earth creationist, I think you could imagine that it's a very difficult thing to be a young Earth creationist who's outwardly espousing your position, knowing that it's going to come under a huge amount of criticism and a lot of ridicule, and you're going to be faced with that constantly. It's got to be a huge burden. And so he begins his article with, very carefully sculpting the idea once again that, they are what is becoming the very small remnant in the United States of the true believers, those who are holding on to the truth, right? There's this, he's talked about Nehemiah in the past and the building of the wall and coming out of Babylon, and how this is like the small remnant of the faithful that are coming back to rebuild society. All right, that fits in with all his culture wars, stuff that he talks about. So, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. But those who enter it are many. But for the gate is narrow and the way that leads to life, for those who find it are few. Right? And there's your you're setting your mood for this particular article. Be the one that finds the narrow gate, and those are few. All right. And the implication is we're the few, right? We're the few inside these walls, inside of our enclave, who are protecting the true word. And then, it's clear that Christians are going to be criticized and condemned, even persecuted, right, for their faith. And yes, that is, something that Paul talks about, is persecution. In this ministry of Answers in Genesis, which is so obviously challenges Christians and non-Christians alike. All right, big emphasis here on Christians. To believe God's word from the very first verse, we receive an enormous amount of opposition and degrees of persecution, all of which are becoming more intense. I found there's 4 types of opposition. And then in this article, he's going to talk about the 4 types of opposition. I think it's really interesting to see how he classifies different groups that are opposing his work. So these are his 4 groups. Opposition from non-Christians. All right, then opposition from church liberals. All right, then opposition from compromising Christians. Right, now you notice that church liberals aren't church liberal Christians, right? They're church liberals, as we'll see. It's not really even considering them Christians. Then there are Christians that are compromising Christians. And then there's opposition from other Christians. And that category, if you're wondering, what category is that? That category is individuals that are young Earth creationists, or at least, say they're young Earth creationists. However, criticize aspects of the young Earth creationist, but in particular, Ken Ham's view of young Earth creationism. In other words, it's the divisiveness and the criticism within the young Earth creationist movement. Right. And compromising Christians are ones that appear to be, faithful Christians in most other ways. And he doesn't want to say they're not Christians, but they're compromised, right? Because they aren't following the young Earth paradigm. On more positive news for Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham tells us that they've reached 10 million guests for the Answers for the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter combined. Now, of course, a lot of those are guests that are the same guests that have gone to both attractions. 10 million guests is nothing to sneeze at. And although there's a lot of discussion about it not, like the Ark Encounter not being as successful as maybe they initially promoted, you've heard me say before, that's all part of promotion too. You oversell, right? You overcommit. You try to make it sound like it's going to be amazing. There's going to be a huge number of people that come, because that actually entices people to come. People want to do things that a lot of other people are doing, because they feel like it must be something really special if a lot of people are there. So I don't begrudge the marketing plan of over promoting and overselling something, or I guess you could call it over promising, but I don't think maybe they dreamed of having that many, but I'm not sure that was a realistic goal to have 2 million plus, each year come to the Ark Encounter. They're more like in the 1 million range or slightly less. Nonetheless, right, having 10 million guests over this period of the last 10 years or so, 10 years for the Creation Museum, the Ark Encounter hasn't been open quite that long, is a lot of people. And this Answers in Genesis is not a failing endeavor, right? It's going to continue. And it's not a raging success financially, but they have a large donor base. And again, they need the donations, because it's not a self-sustaining operation, especially as they're increasing the size of the zoo. They've added a number of different buildings. If you go watch my video in which I tour the grounds of the Ark Encounter, you'll realize that the infrastructure is growing a lot. And when the infrastructure grows a lot, the costs go up a lot. Attendance is not going up at the same pace that their costs are going up. And so that has to be something that they're concerned with all the time. Let me skip over this. Talked about that a lot in a lot of episodes. So let's move on, to another common theme if you've watched This Week in Creationism. And that is the dueling views of what causes adaptation in organisms. With Answers in Genesis and most other creationists, essentially admitting that natural selection plays a large role in sculpting organisms. They'll say that those organisms came with a certain amount of variation that was endowed in those organisms in the creation, but natural selection is the kind of the force that then selects and helps adaptation occur to new environments and changes in environments. But ICR, as I've been telling you, very much rejects that idea. All right, as Jeff Tompkins is saying here, contrary to Darwin's theory, creatures are not molded by the environment, but rather they actively sense the environment and adapt accordingly. Right? They continuously track their environmental surroundings through complex networks of sensors, and they rapidly deploy pre-programmed adaptive solutions to maintain homeostasis, or living in their environment. So they take a very engineered approach, which is, kind of fits with their president, who's an engineer, and this thing called continuous environmental tracking. That's his, or what has become now, Institute for Creation Research's explanation for how organisms adapt to their environment. They are tracking the environment, and they're employing these previously adapted solutions. Let's see another example. I mean, this comes up all the time. I could do this every single week, because they have an article out every week which tries to show how some particular trait of an organism was not sculpted by natural selection, but was simply the organism sensing its environment and then employing a pre-programmed device to then adapt, right? Or basically, you can think of it as, hey, I see this thing I need, now I'm going to turn on that program, and I already have that program. So they are, I guess you could say they're seeing ahead of, that all these programs are already built in ahead of time before they're needed. All right, didn't say that very well. If natural selection is a mystical delusion, right? Guglielmo says just straight out, natural selection isn't a real thing. All right, it's a mystical delusion. What then is driving the adaptations we see in living organisms? And how can the principles of engineering, so these are engineers who are trying to apply engineering principles to biological systems, help us to understand biological design? In this episode, right, President Randy Guglielmo talks about the circuit of reasoning of evolutionary theory and introduces a new theory of biological design known as continuous environmental tracking. One of these days, we're going to have to sit down. We're going to have to really talk about what this continual environmental tracking is and try to make more sense of it. But for now, let me just give you one glimpse of something that I think of when I hear about continuous environmental tracking. I say to myself, okay, great. Organisms are pre-programmed with like a whole bunch of programs in their genome. And all they do is they then have these sensors, all right, where they're sensing the environment. And they say like, oh, it's hotter this year. I'm going to go turn on that program that's going to help me adapt to heat. All right. And so I'll be more adapted to heat as a result. Let's just say that is something that God endowed in organisms, is this sort of mechanical lever system of sort of turning off and on programs through a sensory system. Let's say that really happens. So what I immediately think of is, I think of, okay, why don't organisms really adapt to their environment then? Right? Because there are plenty of organisms that actually aren't perfectly adapted to their environment. In fact, there's so many different parts of organisms that aren't adapted to their environment. But let's keep this even simpler. I will ask this question of Institute for Creation Research's scientists and this continual environmental tracking thing. So you show how these individual systems are amazingly adapted to different environments. What happens when organisms then when the environment reverts back? Why don't the organisms revert back? Why don't they turn off that program and go back to a previous program? So here's a picture of a pronghorn. All right, I took this picture out in Wyoming. And pronghorns are really amazing animals. And one of the things they're known for is their speed. They can run at a pace that possibly is as fast or possibly even a little bit faster than a cheetah. There's debates about which is the fastest animal, cheetahs or pronghorns. Now, the interesting thing about pronghorns is they can run faster than, so much faster than anything else in North America. There's nothing that's going to catch a pronghorn. And they know it, which is one of the reasons they make you can get great photographs of them, is because you can get up pretty close to them because they're not worried about running away from you. They really aren't. So why are they so fast? Why are they so darn fast? Because there's really nothing that can go faster than them except for a bullet. And so they're not adapted to human beings with guns. Right? So apparently there's no pre-programmed, this is a little facetious, but God did not pre-program animals with the capacity to, when they sensed that there's a new development in a human's ability to catch them, like gunpowder, in which they could trip a lever and go like, oh, I'll put on this defense for that, right? Animals just haven't come up with a defense for bullets. All right, sorry, sidebar there. Pronghorns' speed. If nothing can outrun them, why do they run that fast? They could run a lot slower and still be just fine. It takes an enormous amount of energy to run as fast as they do. Their muscles, right, are all adapted to running really fast. Right? You know that it takes something different in terms of their muscular structure and how they utilize their ATPs and all the different physiology of their muscles must be quite different than you and I, because you and I can't run anywhere near as fast as a pronghorn. And so pronghorns are remarkably adapted incredibly efficient bodies for running really fast, and yet they don't need to. So here's the general explanation. Here's the hypothesis about why pronghorns run so fast. You have to think about their historical setting. All right, if you go back in history, what you'll find is that there are these things called cheetahs. All right, and cheetahs at one time lived in North America. In fact, it's thought, based on the fossil record, the evidence from the fossil record, that cheetahs evolved in North America. And then they migrated out of North America to Africa, where you would find them today. But there are cheetah fossils, or at least other species of things like cheetahs. They're in North America. And those fossils suggest they could run really fast. And so the theory here, or the hypothesis here, is that cheetahs and there's a bunch of other different kinds of felines that lived in North America. And we still have some today, right? We have mountain lions. But they're not nearly as fast as a cheetah, and they really can't catch a pronghorn. They could only surprise one by jumping on it. Cheetahs, why are they so fast, you might ask? It's very helpful to run with extreme bursts of speed for them to catch their prey, which is what they use in Africa. If they were in North America, they would have been doing the same thing. There's selective pressure for them to run faster to catch more prey, and so they are evolving traits for faster running, right? Well, what do prey do if an organism is adapting to them? What's the natural selective pressure going to be on prey? It's going to be for them to be able to run faster, right? The better they can avoid the thing chasing them, the better their survival is. And the individuals that survive by running away faster have offspring, and therefore give their offspring the ability to run fast, right? So that's the whole idea. And as they have mutations that change their muscular structure and anatomy slightly and their physiology, that give them more fitness in that environment where they have a fast-running predator. Right? So what I'm describing is a feedback loop between predator and prey, in which you have they're both evolving, right? I'd say it's coevolution. They're both evolving together in the same environment, and one's pushing the other, and the other one's pushing the other constantly to get faster and faster and faster and faster. And so you end up with two animals that are incredibly fast. Now, in the continuous environmental tracking thing, I guess what Institutes for Creation Research would say is that maybe cheetahs lived in North America, and so there was this really fast prey, and so they turned on a program to run fast so they could catch up to that prey. And I don't know, maybe that prey then had additional variations of that program that they could sense in the environment, and so they turned on those particular things. See, they don't want to say it's mutations and there's any kind of like random variation that's involved in this process. So that's why the whole pre-programming thing. So God gave them a number of different levers, and they could switch on a lever and then be like, okay, yeah, I can run even faster and be and therefore be adapted to this environment with these really fast cats. All right, so that's, I don't know, maybe how the continuous environmental tracking thing goes. So here's where my question comes in. This is a long lead up, I know. Hopefully there's some payoff to it. Pronghorns run really fast today. And when was the last time they've seen a cheetah? Thousands of years? Probably tens of thousands of years, if not longer. But in the young Earth creationist timeline, they might say that cats were around and in North America, or cheetahs were around North America sometime, around the Ice Age. So 4,000 years ago. But that means it's been 3,500 to 4,000 years since a pronghorn, which still lives in North America, has seen a cheetah. In other words, they haven't been pressured to run fast in 3,500 years. They've been having one generation of pronghorns after another, and they're still making pronghorns that can run faster than they need to. And if they just slowed down, they could use those resources that they were, their hyped up muscles and all the other stuff they have to allow them to run fast, they could use that for other parts and be more fit for their environment. In other words, they're not actually the most fit for their environment now. They have a skill they don't need. Why don't they simply sense their environment? And it's like, well, there's no cheetahs around, right? There's no organism that can catch me. Why should I run this fast, right? Why should I need to run this fast? They don't need to. Why don't they flip a switch? Where's the program? Where's the change, right? Where are they tracking the environment and adapting to it? And this is just one example of thousands of examples like this, where organisms are either, we would almost say that they're, in this case, the pronghorn looks over-engineered. And it looks over-engineered, and the explanation for that from an evolutionary theory perspective is, well, they look over-engineered because they're adapted to a past environment, and they simply haven't adapted to the present environment because it takes a long time to adapt to your environment at times. Right? It's not, they can still survive running faster than they have to, and therefore there's not a high selection pressure for them to lose the ability to run quickly and slow themselves down to just the speed they need to get away from whatever's the fastest thing that could try to catch them today. And so it might take thousands of more generations to get to that point. What it appears is they're undergoing natural selection. And natural selection is a relatively slow process in many cases when there isn't strong selectional pressure. I think the continuous environmental tracking thing, the way that it's described, why don't they just adapt right away? Why do they wait for hundreds and hundreds of generations before they do anything about it? Why not use the programs they obviously have to run slower? They certainly didn't need to run this fast at the creation, right? Because they were not going to ever be eaten. So there was no need to be able to run incredibly fast speeds at that time. So I would think that ICR would say that their ability to run fast as they do today is the result of them tracking some past environment in which they had to get away from a predator. But they haven't continued to track the environment and continued to change. And this is, like I said before, I could probably come up with thousands of examples like this where it makes sense from a natural selective perspective, but it doesn't really make sense to me in this continual environmental tracking perspective. All right, we spent a lot of time on that. Let's go on to a recent episode of Answers News, which is their program which runs on Facebook Live and on YouTube. And here we have Bodhi Hodge, and that's Gabriella Haynes sitting in the middle. I don't think we've talked about her before, but she has a PhD in some area of paleontology. And she is a relatively recent hire of Answers in Genesis, and she's been on Answers News a fair amount, and she's going to talk about a particular fossil in this episode. And that fossil is an Ichthyosaur. And here's Ken Ham's article that goes with that news item. Scientists discover a fish-like marine reptile buried in its own blubber 150 million years ago. Yeah, so what were they talking about on Answers News? It was the same stuff. I don't watch the show very often because it's kind of a repeat of the same thing over and over and over again. Kind of like how I'm getting repetitive on This Week in Creationism at times. They're talking about a fossil. Oh, it's 150 million years old. Of course, it's not really that old. How could it have been preserved if it was preserved in these really fine sediments? And if it took a long time to get preserved, then how come it didn't get eaten by crabs and other organisms at the time? So casting doubt on the ability for it to preserve in a fashion that wasn't like a global catastrophic flood. All right, it's the same thing. Pick your fossil of the week and then say the same thing about it each time. But I decided I would pick this one out and just take a little closer look at it because I like ichthyosaurs. So here we have the original article from Peer J, the soft tissue and skeletal anatomy. And of course, it's the soft tissue too. The thing really is what got them talking, because they love to point out that there is soft tissue found in these fossils. The soft tissue and skeletal anatomy of 2 late Jurassic Ichthyosaur specimens from the, I'm not going to pronounce that, archipelago. And here's the popular article, and this is the one they refer to on Answers News. And as I listen to them talk, and I go back and I look at this particular article, of course they're not reading the original article. They're reading the blurb that was written, that was in SciTech Daily. I still don't understand why they look at places like SciTech Daily in order to get their news, all right, their science news. There are better outlets that give at least a somewhat better approximation of the original research, but also they have a PhD paleontologist who's on this program talking. What I would like them to do is actually read the original research. And maybe she did. I can't really quite tell listening to it. So she might have in this case. But the original article is quite fascinating. All right, and so I have to tell you where this particular fossil was found. It's found in the Jurassic Solnhofen, and there we go, Platekalk, all right, limestone. It's a particular formation in southern Germany. And this formation, and I've pulled this particular figure from a different article, the oldest Archaeopteryx, a new specimen from the same location or the same formation. And so there are multiple Archaeopteryx samples that have been found in this particular formation. And so what is this rock that this Ichthyosaur was found in? It's in a limestone. And that limestone is found all over southern Germany. It's been mapped to southern Germany. And I want you to look at this map, all right? This dark gray area are where there are sponge and microbial reefs, all right? So they have a whole reef system that's preserved. And you see this is over 20 kilometers wide. So we're looking at over 100-kilometer wide region. And so this is a lagoon, right? This would be very much like a lagoon today in the Caribbean or something like that, where you have these coral reef. We have coral reefs and sponge and microbial reefs. So these are the coral reefs here. So there's a whole variety of different, and this is just like preserved coral that is found in the fossil record. And then you have these basins here, which are full of sand that's now been preserved. But at the time, they would have been sort of lakes, all right? So you had these shallow and sometimes fairly deep lakes, which we do see in some of these lagoon systems even today in different places in the world, where you have this coral growing up and these sponge reefs that then have this lake system within it. And these lakes can be hypersaline, meaning they have very high salt concentrations because you have a lot of evaporation. You have very little flow of water in and out of some of these lake systems. And then the water can become stratified, which it does in certain coral atolls. You'll have lakes in the middle of the atoll, and the water becomes stratified, and the lower layers become very unmixed and then oxygen deprived. Now, you know where I'm going with this, right? So the hypothesis for how this Ichthyosaur is preserved is out here would have been an ocean, all right, at the time. So this is ocean at the time, and then you have this whole area of a lagoon next to this ocean. And so you had an Ichthyosaur, which then traveled in, and it's actually right over here. I think it's right in this region here. That's where the Ichthyosaur is preserved. It's right in here is where one of the Archaeopteryx is preserved. And gotten into this area, and then what they're proposing is that actually there's a large storm, and so you have more input of water into the lagoon area. The Ichthyosaur kind of swims in with that fresh water and then gets trapped in some of these lakes. And some of these lakes are closed off completely surrounded by the sponge reefs, unless it's overtopped by some water during some event. So the Ichthyosaur gets trapped in this area, and then it's in hypersaline water Eventually it dies, either quickly or maybe over a period of time. And then it falls to the bottom in this stratified water column in which you have no oxygen in the bottom. And there you're going to have very little decay. And you're going to have continual rain of sediment from that. And it's just all little bits of shells, right, and sand, calcareous sand, and so forth, that then piles up on top of the specimens and the unfortunate organisms that die in these particular lakes. And that's where Archaeopteryx is a bird, and so if the bird ends up falling in this lake and drowning, it's going to end up at the bottom of one of these lakes, and then it's preserved in these very fine sediments, and so we see them in very great detail. There's lots of famous fossils from different sites in this particular location. All right, so, but remember, in the young Earth creationist, and none of this is really talked about in their talk. Now they talk about, well, scientists think that this was a lagoon and they just got trapped in the lagoon and then died. But then they go on and start talking about, well, why didn't crabs eat, can you believe that they're suggesting that this thing sat at the bottom of the lake and didn't get eaten by crabs or other organisms, didn't get disturbed? How could it possibly get preserved? The only way it could have gotten preserved is by a chaotic, massive flood like the worldwide flood that would have instantly covered it with lots and lots of sediment at one time. No. And then they further go on to suggest that we never see this kind of preservation that's being suggested here today. No, there's organisms that have died in coral, in lagoons, for which their bodies are lying on the bottom and covered with sediments. And there isn't any reason to believe that if they get completely, if sedimentation continues, eventually they're going to become future fossils, right? We see this type of thing occurring today. I wanted to show you that the particular limestone that now is what this whole entire formation is very famous limestone because of its very compact, and it makes for great sculptures. And so there's a lot of famous sculptures that come from this particular location. Can you imagine a global flood which has deposited hundreds, if not thousands of feet of sediment below these limestone layers? In other words, below what this lagoon, and then deposited all of this coral reefs in what looks to be what we looked like as a lagoon system. And then on top of that, deposited a whole bunch of other sediments later on, right, which now have eroded away. So we see these lagoon preserves. Can you imagine a global flood somehow preserving the extremely fine sediments in these lakes inside of these lagoons, in which they're all made of the same substance for, and as you can see right here, 10, 15 feet thick. And this is what the fossils are found in, is this type of material. I thought a global flood would have, muds and silts and other pieces of debris, and you wouldn't get just this pure limestone like right in the middle of the flood. I just, when I hear descriptions of these on, they bring up the fossil and all they want to say is, oh, look, here's a fossil and it's so exquisitely preserved, only the flood could do that, without realizing that there are many other conditions in which the actual fossil setting itself doesn't make sense within a global flood perspective at all. All right, but they don't really discuss those details. They don't seem to think about those at all. It's just another excuse to say, oh, look at this fossil that you might have heard about. It must have been preserved by the flood. The New Creation blog. Glorifying God, the hidden diversity of creation kinds. And I'm only bringing this up because this is a Kurt Wise article. And I find Kurt Wise to be a really intriguing writer. He is very out-of-the-box thinker in terms of creationism. And this article has a lot of out-of-the-box sort of type of thoughts about where the diversity of created kinds comes from. And the reasons why kinds have diversified. And so I'm not going to go through that article in This Week in Creationism. I'm saving that up to kind of like, I think I'm just going to read the whole article and comment on it in a separate video later. And lastly, This is just kind of a fun item, but one I'm curious about, and maybe somebody will have some insight and they could share with me. It was pointed out to me that Nathaniel Jensen has a Twitter account. And of course, I follow lots of creationists, and I had not noticed a Twitter account for Nathaniel Jensen. Well, as you can see, it's a very new Twitter account, joined March 2022. And it looks like a Twitter account that was created solely for the purpose of promoting his new book, Traced, although he's using an image from Replacing Darwin as his cover image here. But now, but the interesting thing about this Twitter page is, I'm not sure this is Nathaniel Jensen. All right, I'm not sure this is Nathaniel Jensen. So you'll see that he's following one individual, and he has 274 followers. So if you look at who Nathaniel Jensen is following, this is the page that he's following, which in looking at the various followers and followings of this particular Twitter page, I don't see any connection to any interest of Nathaniel Jensen. And so it's a very curious single follow for somebody to have. And then if you look at the followers of Nathaniel Jensen, this is just a snapshot of a few of the followers. And of the 274, at least 200 of them look like this. Now, but interestingly, here's one, haplogroup G, and I have seen several different accounts that reference haplogroups, which is what Nathaniel Jensen's interested in the book Traced. But most of these are Middle Eastern accounts, and many of them are very recent accounts, started nearly the same time as Nathaniel Jensen started his. And so to me, I don't actually think this is Nathaniel Jensen. I think this is somebody acting as Nathaniel Jensen, and that's the problem with the internet, right? I mean, it's about identity. It's hard to really to know. But it gets a little more curious. I would have thought this is just a fake account, right? Somebody set up this account, and they're friends of Nathaniel Jensen or somebody who admires Nathaniel Jensen. And they're just making this up because they want to promote his work. Or he just has a fanatical following in the Middle East, of those who just love Nathaniel Jensen, but I've never heard him talk about any kind of connections that way before. So this Twitter account, he's only tweeted a few times, but he's replied and commented on several other posts, and he is promoting his book, Traced, with the same kind of promotions that he does on some of his other social media. But then look here, even in his responses, let me get rid of this ink. Even in his responses, here is an individual who I know is a real individual who has a lot of interest in Nathaniel Jensen's, well, like I say, he likes Nathaniel Jensen, but he has an interest in his work. But who apparently bought the Kindle version of the book and has this interaction with the account Nathaniel Jensen. But look how specific Nathaniel Jensen's comments are. Right? He's talking about, are you looking at the ebook with the end chapter 11, start chapter of 12? That's where your pages are. And then he says they're trying to fix this. Apparently there's some bad hyperlinking in the Kindle version. And he says they're working on fixing this. I'm told that some color plates are referenced in multiple places. They have the inserts. They have to insert all these by hand. I'm hoping they'll have the hot link version soon. This doesn't sound like somebody that doesn't have specific information on the inner workings that Answers in Genesis would know, unless they're just making this up in order to have a conversation with somebody that is asking questions on this Twitter page. So very, very curious. I don't really know if this is Nathaniel Jensen or not. I'm leaning toward this is not Nathaniel Jensen. I still think this is just some great admirer of Nathaniel Jensen that is pretending to be him. But if Nathaniel Jensen sees this and it's not, I would suggest that he tries to get it. He lets people know that this isn't him, because who knows what this person will say or do with this particular account. Yeah, social media. It's hard to know the truth on social media. Like I said, this is not really any kind of criticism of Nathaniel Jensen at all. It's more of a FYI. I don't know what's going on here. Should I be paying attention to this particular Twitter account? Or is this some wild creation of somebody that Nathaniel Jensen doesn't know? And maybe Nathaniel Jensen doesn't even know this person is doing this. So that's hey, just letting you know, somebody out there is pretending to be you. All right, that's it for this week in creationism. Yeah, that was a kind of a long, rambly trip. I've have a lot of other items coming up, and I should be able to get back on schedule doing this more on a weekly basis, in which case I'll be keeping up with the creationist literature a little bit better going forward in the summer, and should be able to hone in on a couple of the different themes that I've covered in the last 6 months. So things that I've been seeing over and over and over again. What I would like to do is kind of like tackle some of the major themes in a more organized fashion than me kind of talking off the top of my head as I have been doing here today. Well, thanks for hanging out with me, and we'll see you next time on This Week in Creationism. Thanks. Bye-bye.